What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and I figured while we're on a little bit of a stint talking about the new Astra Militarum Codex for 9th edition 40k, as we are nearing its official release outside of a pre-packaged boxed set, we'd continue to talk about some big battle tanks. And this time, it's the brand new tank for the Astra Militarum, that being the Rogal Dorn. As always in these datasheet deep dive videos, we're going to do a datasheet review where we dive into the stats and mechanics of the Rogal Dorn battle tank, as well as talk about some synergies that you can use with the Rogal Dorn with other mechanics in the Astra Militarum Codex, including Regimental subfactions, tank ace abilities, Mechanized orders, and Stratagems, before comparing it to the old staple, the Lehman Russ battle tank, and finally asking, is the Rogal Dorn worth taking in your Imperial Guard army? As always, if you like my Warhammer 40k videos, go ahead and drop a like on the video, drop a subscribe down below. It really helps me out. I appreciate it. And you get to watch more of my videos. It's a win-win. And with that, let's dive into the Rogal Dorn battle tank. For a whopping 250 points, the Rogal Dorn has a pretty impressive stat block, as I think befits a huge, I guess it's just a heavy tank. Sure, we'll go with that. That sounds good. It's coming in at an incredible toughness of 9 and 17 wounds, both of which sort of encapsulate the Rogal Dorn's place on the battlefield. This thing does not pack as much of a punch for its cost as the Lehman Russ battle tank, but makes up for it in insane survivability with a 2+ save, a boatload of wounds, and several effects that you can apply to it to increase its survivability that we're going to be talking about later. It also has an absolute smorgasbord of guns able to be strapped to the hull. It comes stocked with a Castigator Gatling Cannon, a 12-shot Strength 5 AP1 rotary gun, a heavy stubber on the top, as well as a twin battle cannon, two of the main weapons of the Lehman Russ battle tank stapled together. That base twin battle cannon profile comes out at a Strength 8 AP3 2 damage, 2d6 shot 72-inch range blast weapon with the turret weapon characteristic. That is the new special rule coming out of Astra Militarum that gives it +1 to hit and allows it to fire out of melee even when the tank is engaged. There are a lot of optional upgrades for the Rogal Dorn as well. You can swap out a couple of those guns for alternative options. The Castigator Gatling Cannon specifically can be dropped for a Pulverizer Cannon, a 24-inch range D6 shot, Strength 8 AP2, 3 damage blast weapon, essentially a small version of the tried and true Demolisher Cannon. You can also staple a ton of additional guns to the Rogal Dorn battle tank, including 2 hull-mounted heavy stubbers or melta guns, and a pair of either multi-meltas or heavy bolters on the sponsons, giving the tank an immense amount of firepower. I think the most exciting swap for me is the turret weapon, the Oppressor Cannon. This comes with a coaxial autocannon, just as 2-shot Strength 7 AP1 2 damage attacker, but has that turret weapon keyword. The Oppressor Cannon itself is very impressive with a 90-inch range, shooting D6 +3, Strength 10 AP3 4 damage blast attacks, and I think that's where you're going to be going a lot of the time. When you do the math out, the twin battle cannon, if you're not using rerolls or pound them to dust, a tank order that we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to be getting an average of 7 shots at that Strength 8 AP3 3 damage profile. The Oppressor Cannon, on the other hand, you're going to get an average of 6.5 with additional strength and additional damage, which seems like a pretty good trade-off. The other benefit of the Oppressor Cannon is that it has a lower floor. You get a minimum of 4 shots at the Oppressor, although the ceiling's a little bit lower. That twin battle cannon can shoot 12 shots, but equally could only shoot 2. If you're expecting to CP reroll or trigger the blast keyword on the twin battle cannon, it might be a little bit better, but generally speaking, I think the Oppressor Cannon, especially for dealing with other armored vehicles or tanks, is going to be a lot more effective. Last but not least, we can take Armored Tracks for 5 additional points. This gives the tank the Armored keyword, which can affect some of its stratagems, and gives it +1 save against 1 damage attacks, bringing it to effectively a 1+ save. This is kind of the Armor of Contempt style ability that Astra Militarum vehicles are getting in place of the actual Armor of Contempt that they had in the previous version of the Codex, thanks to the Data Slate update. Also important on the Rogal Dorn is its access to both the battle tank and squadron keyword, meaning that it benefits from most abilities that affect vehicles in the entirety of the Codex. You're going to be able to issue your mechanized orders to it, you're going to be able to reroll its hit rolls with Lord Solar Leontis. All of those things are going to work on this guy just fine. So now let's jump into the remainder of the Codex and talk about some specific synergies that I think work alongside the Rogal Dorn. First off, we have regimental traits. These work differently in Astra Militarum than they do in any other Codex because you're able to pick your regimental traits regardless of the subfaction your army is. Effectively, you don't actually have a subfaction, you just pick the two chapter tactics effectively that you want. Now, Born Soldiers is the standard one. That is the normal 6s to hit, automatically wound, and count as 6s, which, to be honest, is pretty great. This is pretty solid, and I think a lot of Astra Militarum armies are just going to be building for this if they don't have a specific combo in mind. Speaking of specific combos, however, if you're bringing a mechanized company and focusing on those big heavy tanks, the Armored Superiority trait counts the Rogal Dorn as additional models for holding objectives. This is even better if you have a nearby tank commander or even the Rogal Dorn itself with some upgrades to give it objective secured. Heirloom Weapons increases the range of the Rogal Dorn's weapons, although you don't really need it. However, it is super useful if you have equipped melta-guns, multi-meltas, or just also on those hull-mounted weapons like the Pulverizer Cannon or the Onslaught Gatling Cannon. Trophy Hunters gives additional strength in targeting enemy monsters or vehicles. This actually can be pretty useful if you're using the Strength 8 loadout. If you have a focus on those multi-meltas or even the Twin Battle Cannon, getting +1 strength against Toughness 8 enemies can be pretty useful. The downside, of course, of Trophy Hunters is that it removes access to another Regimental tactic, so you may not want to be using that one too often. Elite Sharpshooters gives you a floating reroll once per shooting activation, which you can use to ensure that those big attacks from the Oppressor Cannon hit. Although if you have another way that you're going to be consistently giving the Rogal Dorn rerolls, you may not want to take this one too highly. Although, to be fair, you can order it to reroll its own ones. It gets a floating reroll, which means it's probably going to be rerolling most of its hits with its big turret weapon. Last but not least, we have Industrial Efficiency, which allows it to ignore AP1 attacks. You can sort of stack this with the Armored Tracks to have a pretty wide variety of attacks that you're going to be reducing the effectiveness of. Now we're going to talk about some tank ace abilities. These are points upgrades that you can attach to the tanks in your army to give them specific benefits. Now, all of them obviously apply pretty universally to vehicles, although some of them I don't really think you need too much. Especially effects like Mechanical Pack Rat that gives you a transhuman effect, even though your Toughness 9 is not going to come into play super often, and Knight of Piety gives you a 5+ invulnerable save, but you have other access to 5+ invulnerable save if you have Psychers in your army, and with a 2+ save and a couple different ways to reduce incoming AP, I don't know how often a 5+ invuln is going to be super useful. The ones I really like, however, are Vaunted Praetorian. This turns the Rogal Dorn into basically a tank commander and gives it the ability to target itself. This allows the Rogal Dorn to operate independently, even in the absence of other tank commanders, or sort of be the center of your gun line. I kind of like the idea that the big heavy Rogal Dorn tank can operate as the command and control center for a whole group of Lehman Russ battle tanks. That's pretty cool. Meticulous Calibrator allows you to ignore cover. That's just pretty sick, especially if you're shooting into enemies with Armor of Contempt or a high base armor save that are hiding in cover. Mostly just gives you +1 AP, especially because you have a decent AP on most of the big cannons that the Rogal Dorn is carrying. Master of Camouflage gives you the benefits of light cover while more than 12 inches away from enemies. This stacks exceedingly well with the 2+ armor save that the Rogal Dorn has, and like we mentioned before, the several ways it has to potentially reduce incoming AP or improve its own save against low AP or low damage enemy attacks. Veteran Commander gives you access to an additional Regimental Doctrine. This means you can do something like take Born Soldiers and then also have access to Heirloom Weapons, for example, to extend the range of your Melta weapons. Now, we talked a little bit about the effects of orders on the squadron units in your army and the ability to upgrade the Rogal Dorn to issue those orders. And let's talk about some of the mechanized orders that are going to be most beneficial to the Rogal Dorn. The first one is the first one on the list, Pound Them to Dust. This allows you to double the model count of any units that you're targeting for the purposes of determining your blast keyword. This means that if you're shooting at a unit that is 5 models or below, it's still going to give you a minimum of 3 shots on all your blast weapons. If you happen to target a unit that is above 5 models, it's actually going to max the number of attacks that your blast weapons have. This doesn't happen too often, but can mean if you are running that double battle cannon build, you can do a significant amount of additional damage to relatively large enemy units. Even units of 6 to 10 models are going to be absolutely pulverized. Gunner's Kill on Sight gives you reroll hit rolls of 1, so pretty self-explanatory. You get some rerolls. Rerolls are great. And lastly, Shock and Awe gives the tank objective secured. This is especially good when using the Armored Superiority sub-faction ability that lets it count as additional models when holding objectives. Next up, we'll talk about stratagems, and there are a bunch of stratagems that affect the battle tanks in an Astra Militarum army. Overlapping Fields of Fire is the first one. It gives you access to wound rerolls and additional AP on 6s, especially useful with Born Soldiers or using Ingrained Precision, which allows you to trigger your Born Soldiers rolls on higher numbers, on 5+ instead of just 6, because those Born Soldiers rolls will automatically convert into +1 AP, counting as wound rolls of 6. Most importantly, I think this is basically the only way that Rogal Dorns get access to wound rerolls naturally, so definitely want to keep in mind. Relentless allows it to operate at full wound count, so even if it has a single wound remaining, it's going to consider itself to be at its top bracket. Vengeful Salute lets it fire with its turret weapons after the unit goes down. Pretty useful, especially with that oppressor cannon, since you have such an immense amount of potential damage. The other benefit there is that the Rogal Dorn, despite its big size and points cost, is considered a battle tank, so it is a little bit cheaper using Vengeful Salute on it. Crush Them makes it better in melee. It doesn't have a melee weapon, so that one's not that exciting, to be honest, although you do have the potential to do some mortal wounds, so that's good. Smoke launchers you can deploy for 1 CP to give it -1 to be hit. I really like this because it allows you to stack a ton of defensive buffs on a unit that is already significantly difficult to remove. This thing is T9, has 17 wounds, and is basically a 1+ or even some cases a 0+ armor save. Being -1 to be hit on top of that makes it functionally impossible to kill. And speaking of being functionally impossible to kill, we also have Ablative Plating for 2 CP, allowing you to give it -1 damage. So we can stack light cover, T9, 17 wounds with -1 damage, -1 to be hit, and potentially AP reduction. Holy crap. And speaking of how much of a monster it is, let's compare it to the other monster of the Imperial Guard Codex, the tried and true old staple, the Lehman Russ. Now today what we're going to be doing is comparing these two units' damage output to 3 pretty common styles of stat line that we see in the game, those being a Guardsman equivalent, a T3 5+ save enemy, a Marine equivalent, a T4 2 wound, 2+ save enemy. We're going to be doing that because of either Armor of Contempt or Light Cover. It's probably going to be in one or both of those, so I think just averaging it to a 2+ save makes the most sense, or a Vehicle equivalent that is T7 with a 2+ save. Again, probably has Armor of Contempt, so let's be honest. If we take a look at the Rogal Dorn's potential damage against Guardsman equivalents, it's going to be dealing a massive 21.34 damage, but there's a lot of spillover there, only killing on average, and keep in mind this is with no rerolls, 7.667 T3 5+ save enemy models. Now obviously you can be assigning rerolls to these things to actually ensure that you clear out all of the units in, for example, a 10-man Guardsman squad, so that shouldn't be too hard. We're also not considering any regimental traits in here as well, so Born Soldiers may also come into effect. This is just the absolute raw damage. Marine equivalents, it's doing 12.5 damage, or around 4 dead models. Again, a lot of spillover damage, and I should mention in this case as well, we are considering this to be run with the Oppressor Cannon, which is, to be fair, a little bit worse against those low toughness, low wound count enemies. Last but not least, we have the Vehicle equivalents, the T7 2+ save enemies, that an Oppressor Cannon and Pulverizer build Rogal Dorn deals 9.981 damage to, almost right on the cusp of 10 damage all by itself. While the new Astra Militarum Codex is still relatively new, a single Lehman Russ build has sort of won out, that being the Lehman Russ Executioner. This is a D6 plus 3 shot, potentially 3 damage plasma cannon on that turret-mounted weapon that hits on 3s. We're also going to be assuming that this has a hull-mounted las cannon. In this case, the Lehman Russ kills 5 Guardsman equivalents, dealing 12.29 damage. Against Marine equivalents, it does a little bit better, killing 3 models with 10 damage, so still a lot of spill over there. And versus Vehicle equivalents, it does just about 20% less than the Rogal Dorn at 8 damage. So the real question is, if you compare these two stat lines, whether or not the Rogal Dorn is worth it over the Lehman Russ. Now, obviously, the Lehman Russ is doing significantly less damage than a Rogal Dorn unbuffed. It does about 30% less against Guardsman equivalents, 25% less against Marine equivalents, and about 20% less against vehicles. The issue there, though, is that the Lehman Russ does cost 40% less than the Rogal Dorn itself, meaning that the Rogal Dorn is significantly less efficient at dealing damage than the Lehman Russ. So, should you throw out your Rogal Dorns and take only Lehman Russ battle tanks? I don't think it's quite as cut and dry as that. The big benefit here is that the Rogal Dorn also can fit a ton of additional equipment. You can put additional heavy stubbers on it, you can put multi-meltas in the sponsons, and you can make it really a focal point for a lot of your offensive buffs. If you are looking for a place to put Lord Solar Leontis' rerolls, for example, or any of your tank commander orders, a Rogal Dorn is going to send those effects a lot farther than a Lehman Russ is. In addition, the Rogal Dorn is significantly harder to deal with return fire shooting. That toughness 9 makes a huge difference, meaning that a lot of strength 8 incoming attacks are actually going to fail against it now that they would need to wound on 5s rather than 4s as they would against the standard Lehman Russ. And like we talked about all the way through this video, you can stack a ton of defensive benefits on this thing. You can give it +1 save in multiple different ways, -1 AP, -1 damage, -1 to be hit, potential trans hitman effect from Night Shroud Shroud, and with a huge amount of 17 wounds and access to Relentless to run itself back up to top bracket if it ever actually does get bracketed, the Rogal Dorn very quickly enters the point where your opponents simply can't kill it. So, especially with its extreme range, able to sit in the back corner of your deployment zone and just plug away at the enemy all game, it's probably going to be doing a lot more sustained damage than you'll see out of a Lehman Russ. So while I do think that the Lehman Russ is overall probably going to be a more effective choice, I don't think that the Rogal Dorn is entirely overshadowed by its older sibling. And I do think that the Rogal Dorn is going to be pretty useful, especially in one-offs in your army, especially as a way to both concentrate those buffs and be extremely survivable against enemy fire. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the video. Let me know down in the comments what you think about the Rogal Dorn versus the Lehman Russ and which one you're going to be adding to your Astra Militarum army. And if you've noticed any synergies in the codex that I potentially missed, or any thoughts you have about the comparison between the two battle tank styles. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you so much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.